Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first PTCMW event of 2021. My name is Emilee Tison, and I'm a senior behavioral scientist with BetterUp. I'm also the new VP of programs for PTC. So before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to make several quick announcements. First, I'd like to congratulate and welcome our newly elected board members for 2021. Our recorder is Kira Foley, our secretary, Ariel Rogers, our treasurer, Richard Evans, our president, Rob Calderon, and our president-elect, Marnie Falcone. Second, I'd like to make a quick plug for our February event, which will be an IO Psychology career panel aimed at current graduate students. And this will be co-sponsored both with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County IO Psych program and with the Blacks in IO Psychology organization. This event will be held on February 16th and moderated by PTC President Rob Calderon. And this event is traditionally held on campus at UMBC, but because it will be virtual this year and of no cost to students, we'd love to have our membership help us spread the word more broadly to other IO programs across the country. So more to come soon on that. But without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Emilee Tison. Dr. Tison received her master's degree and Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology from Virginia Tech and is currently a principal consultant at DCI Consulting Group, where she is the selection and assessment area lead in the employment and litigation services division. Prior to joining DCI, Emilee worked at the U.S. Office of Personnel Management and as a personnel research psychologist in the selection and promotion assessment group. Emilee has a tremendous amount of expertise in employment testing, job analysis and validation strategies, and quantitative methods in the equal opportunity and employment context. As many of you know, Emilee has dedicated a generous amount of her time to PTCMW, serving in a variety of roles. Most recently, Emilee served as the 2020 PTCMW president. We just want to thank you, Emilee, for all of your service. Before I pass it over to you, I would like to share something else that everyone may enjoy. Emilee shared with me that she has really developed quite the green thumb during the pandemic and has successfully grown an avocado tree from a seed, and it's now approximately 3 feet tall. That is significantly more progress than I've made on anything since this pandemic has started. So we'd just like to, again, recognize and congratulate you, Emilee. Fantastic work. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Emilee Tison to present her presidential address. Please feel free to use the chat function, but we will hold all other questions until the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I won't talk about all the plants I did kill, but at least the avocado is surviving. Welcome. Thank you all for joining. I struggled over this topic, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the reason I chose what it is I'm going to talk about. But I'm really excited that you joined me for my outgoing presidential address, and I'm really going to focus on some personal thoughts around expanding the impact of IO psychology in practice. And this truly is based on my experiences over the last few years and some thoughts that I've been having, some work I've been doing and planning on doing in the upcoming projects with clients. So the way I'm going to approach this, I'm going to give you a very quick introduction, very quick background around this topic, and then I'm going to focus the presentation itself on two primary areas, really doing a deep dive into selection process reviews, and I'll explain what I mean by that term, as well as pay equity reviews. And that actually might be something more than what you think I'm actually talking about. And then I'll sum it up with very quick final thoughts and then open it up for questions and see if you guys want to discuss anything else as a group. So through my introduction, you've already heard that I work with DCI Consulting Group. I think it's important to tell you a little bit about my company so that you have a little bit more context around why I'm talking about what I'm talking about and the lens that I have as part of this. So DCI Consulting Group has been around since 2001. We are an HR compliance, data analysis, risk management firm located in Washington, D.C. And the information that you see on the screen here is a pretty good snapshot of the type of work that we typically perform. We have work in the compliance space where we do OFCCP compliance work, as well as diversity and inclusion work. You'll see some topics here that are more traditional IO, personnel selection and testing and validation. We also do work in the pay equity space. And given that we have a litigation support component as well, we can do any and all of those within that context. For me personally, as you can tell from that type of company, I'm an external consultant. So that's really the primary lens that I'm speaking from. I do work, as was mentioned in the intro, in our selection and assessment group. I am the lead of that particular group, so most of my work does fall within that category. And primarily my clients are proactive in nature. They're coming before they have any particular issues or any particular audits or litigation, but I also work in a litigation context. Outside of selection assessment, I also do some pay equity work as well, so it's not always in the selection and assessment focus. As noted, I also do have some prior federal experience, but I'm speaking primarily from the last few years in my current role. It's important that I do tell you those last two things on the slide, so I have this in the recording. Everything in this deck is my own expressed opinion and does not necessarily represent the opinion of DCI Consulting Group. And what I'm going to talk about here is going to be in very broad terms during this presentation. Keep in mind, though, in research that you would be doing in client work, context matters. So make sure that you keep that in mind. And not everything I'm going to say here may directly apply with some of the stuff you'll be dealing with. So I went back and forth on this topic for today's session. To be honest, I landed on this, one, because it's of personal interest. I'm interested in talking about how we can expand the value of IO and how we can really showcase the skills that we provide. And two, because it's a recurrent activity in my daily life when I engage with clients. This is something that I am often faced with, as I'm sure most of you are too, with that idea of trying to demonstrate the value that we have, or fighting for particular activities we know might benefit our client, or even explaining how my solutions aren't going to necessarily fix everything, and why that doesn't undermine the value of having an IO perspective and actually can be very, very important. Now, we could talk about communication style, we could talk about learning business speak, we could talk about identifying key partnerships in an organization, focusing on utility and bottom line. There are many other ways we could address this type of question. And to be honest, those are fantastic topics to talk about. But there have also been other IOs that have provided great insight into these areas, and I'm not going to rehash those here. What I wanted to do instead was really focusing on this idea of selling a skill set beyond our IO products. And some of this comes with comfort in your area and experience in your field, but instead of pushing what we can do a job analysis, why don't we push the skills that are used to do a job analysis and how that can be really important even outside of that particular context. So I'm going to demonstrate how pushing the skill set itself into particular research efforts have been fruitful in my own career. And as I said earlier, this will be in the selection process context as well as a pay equity context. And I'm focused on these two, one, because they're things I'm currently doing, but they've also grown in the past few years that I've had more and more clients see the value and request some of the stuff more often, and it's just been growing in interest from my client base. So I thought they were really two good examples to focus on. So let's start with the selection process reviews. What do I actually mean when I say that? You're probably going to hear me describe it and say, okay, well, we do this already. What's really the change? So when I'm talking about selection process review, in my recent past, I would have said this was an important component of much of IO selection work to identify needs or to scope projects, maybe focused on the selection tools themselves, the performance space that we're focusing on, and any implementation components where you might look at the actual tools that are being used, address questions of job relatedness, maybe identify new tools for development, among other things. And in fact, as part of this process, clients often come with a specific problem or request in hand. And so you do this digging to understand what's important to know about that problem, that request. Now, when you do this, for those of you who do this often, you sometimes uncover that what's being asked for is not always the best solution. That's a conversation for another day, but all of this to say that this information gathering process, this is what I'm calling the selection process review. What do you need to know about that selection process to help you do the work you're tasked with doing? So I'm going to walk through a quick example because I need to illustrate how it's changed slightly for me in the past few years. Let's say you have a client that comes to you and they actually want to improve the quality of hires going through their selection process. So they come to you with a specific request to create a better assessment or a new assessment to improve that quality. So you'll go through the process of collecting job-related information. You may evaluate their current selection process, review their current assessments, maybe look at alignment to the performance space, understand existing skill gaps, talk to people maybe about the current process and some things that would be really useful to change. And you'd really focus on collecting that information directly involved with the hiring decisions. Some of this may focus on test modalities, cut score consideration, the test order, and so on and so on. You can see that there are many different ways you could evaluate that particular context. For most projects, though, you'd become pretty hyper-focused on the selection decisions and improving that particular space. And that's great, that's important, that's the focus of your research, and that makes sense that you would do that. That information is going to allow you to be the best at developing whatever solutions you're going to develop. But maybe part of the way through, and this also often happens too, right? Clients kind of change their mind halfway through. They're still concerned with improving quality of hires. What if they also don't want to lose the volume of individuals that make it through the process? So they want to retain that. So maybe they want you to add more to the selection process. They want to maintain this high quality, but they need the flow to still be there at the end because maybe they have a lot of selections to make. Well, in this instance, you might want to know more information then. You might be interested now in recruiting or sourcing information. What type of candidates come through the process? Now, in my experience, and maybe this was in part how some of our projects were postured, clients often indicated that this was outside of scope or someone else's responsibility and didn't really matter for what they were asking me to do. But think about it, if high quality candidates aren't targeted through the recruiting efforts, you may not have a high proportion of them making it through the process itself. You'll continuously funnel people down and restrict the amount of people that are coming through if you're focusing on that high quality. And you get to the end of this project and you created this great tool that you think really does differentiate high quality talent from others. But if you don't have the flow, it might not be seen as a success. You still haven't done the second piece of that puzzle. So what's changed in this approach? How have I tried to show a skill set effort that sort of changes the narrative here and allows me a little bit more success? And it's a subtle change. So now, really focus on a more fuller, holistic selection process review that's scoped as part of initial research. It's a much better way to understand and evaluate the full selection cycle and potentially identify recommendations or notable evaluation components prior to actually kicking off, let's say, your assessment development effort. Now, you might say, not everyone can do a full process review. This isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all. We can't do this. And you're right. This actually varies in level of in-depthness or specificity based on the client and the research that we're doing. But every project I have now has an upfront carved out initial research piece where we do more digging that's a little bit broader than the specific request that we're doing, what the client came with a particular request. So it gives us an opportunity to understand the situation, the context we're working, sets expectations to why we're doing what we're doing and what's to be gained from it, and provides clients with extra insight into items we may not be addressing directly. And what's happened is clients are starting to see that they're getting more value out of our interactions beyond the specific request in hand. Beyond this, and purely selfishly, of course I want more information before I do my full project, because what I don't want to do is get into a situation where you're halfway through a project and you realize that the scope is actually a little different, or the client's expectations are a little bit different. Sorry, I've never advanced my slide, apologies there. That the situation changes, and really what it ends up being at the end of the day is not necessarily the way you would have established your research had you known all the details. So this little piece of change here, that upfront holistic selection review, where we do it a little bit broader than just the tools that's being used. It might focus on recruitment efforts. It might focus on the implementation of some of those selection processes and talking to people about how those work. It may have a little bit of a flavor from an efficiency standpoint, what's working and what's not working. It can also go into onboarding and contextual factors outside of a purely selection-focused question. What I'm going to talk about in the next couple slides is fleshing this out a little bit more, but in the full research realm. If someone comes to you and wants to do the full selection process, I'm going to show you how I've established some parameters around that to demonstrate added value for my clients, and how our skill sets are reaching beyond what my clients would traditionally come to us for, which is most often going to be assessment development or validation work. So the IO perspective piece here is one where we should be, and I think we are, very good at determining what our research focus and goal is. And this is critical for this type of work. It's also critical for your job analysis work, to be honest. It's critical for any of your assessment development. So this isn't new to IO, and I think this is important. But for these broader selection process reviews, this becomes even more critical, because it'll drive your actual methodology. So what is your client's goal? This upfront conversation with my clients provides me to flesh this out. Are you just interested in a risk identification or improvement of quality of hires, so you want to focus on assessment? Are you also interested in candidate experience or process efficiencies? Tell me what the focus is for the research, and then we can develop the methodology and collect the information to help answer questions about this or address any issues that arise based off of this. It's important with this type of research, and especially when I get into the pay equity research, to have a good partner with legal counsel. They're going to be your best friend, and there's a couple different reasons why they're your best friend. One, to be completely honest, it gives you more weight and credibility as an expert, and some of the information that you're espousing off there. They're also a great partner when you're doing more risk identification activities. They can have another lens from a purely legal perspective. But also it can provide a blanket of privilege to the work that you're doing. A lot of my clients right now have gone full swing into this, and what they want, risk identification. Tell me everywhere I could potentially have a problem. If I'm audited, or if I have a legal case that comes through, what are the areas we need to spend time on to improve? Is that validation evidence for some of our tools? Do we have identified subgroup differences in the first place? Whatever it might be, identifying those risks can be risky if you don't have that umbrella of privilege as part of it. So that's always a good first step. So once you have your goal, you talk to your client, you have an understanding what they need. The next piece here that I think is really important, and again, something we do really well with the IO skill set, is how are we going to evaluate these components? And this is important to talk through too, because there are different ways you could evaluate the risks of a process, or how are we going to improve quality of hires. And some of those are tool-specific evaluation factors, and you may have many, many more that align to this, but some big buckets could be looking for the existing documentation. If anyone here works with federal contractors and they're ever audited, the very first question they ask for is, show me your documentation. Do you have technical reports? Do you have statements that tell me this is why you do what you do and the policies that exist? So maybe there's a layer here from an evaluation standpoint where you are looking for documentation. Maybe it is implementation features. Do you have structure around this process? Where are the points of undue discretion? How can we go through and evaluate this with that IO lens? We think about this a lot, especially in terms of structured interviews. We talk about elements of structure and elements that improve the ability to stave off bias from the processes that we have. So you can use that lens as well to help you with the broader review. You could look at the technical rigor of how things are developed, the tools that they have. Data requirements is probably one of my favorites. If your client is audited or anyone comes in, they'll ask for particular types of data points for evaluation to do adverse impact analyses or maybe some test evaluation. Do they even have the data requirements to provide that? And in many cases, the answer for some of my clients is no. Either they have multiple systems that have different data components and those systems don't talk to one another. This becomes a very manual process, and you can actually help them identify how to better set themselves up from a data requirement standpoint to be able to report on things and to look proactively for some of the decision processes that they have. Another flagship item that clients that I've had in the recent past have been interested in is really this communication and transparency. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit more when we get to pay equity, but maybe that's a problem. How do employees view this process? In the selection realm, it could be candidates. Do they understand the process that they're going through and what the expectations are? Do they understand information about the job and what's expected of them, the qualifications? So you can collect information around that. And of course, you can always think about the auditing and monitoring processes of this too, and what you have there. Again, legal counsel is great to have involved so they can direct this research, but a lot of different avenues that might be of interest to your clients. And the last piece that I want to call out is the data collection efforts. And we often think of the types of things that make sense, right? When we do job analytic work, we might do document review, we might do interviews, do surveys. I think the same types of methodologies work really well here. But if you think about the focus of your research and the evaluation factors you have, that's going to drive how you establish these data collection efforts. Nothing we do is a one-size-fits-all. We have to understand the context that we're working in and make sure that our research aligns to that. And here's where you get a little bit more freedom, to be honest, with data sources. What types of data sources might answer questions about transparency? What type of data sources might answer more in-depth questions about the technical feasibility of what they're doing or the risk involved with some of the activities? And a lot of these are going to look very familiar to things that we would typically look into if we were doing job analysis or assessment development efforts. So we could look at policy documents, we could look at mission statements, interviews with folks, maybe technical documentation or manuals for any of their tools. I've found that exit interviews can be extremely important. Maybe employee surveys, even engagement surveys can be very important and informative. You could conduct or look at benchmarking studies as well. Depending on what your research questions are, these data sources can be quite extensive. And I would encourage you to be creative. See what data might exist for the particular client and see how you could leverage that to answer your questions. So how is this different? Why am I even talking about this? This might be something you already do, and if so, I'd love to talk about this with you and be like, okay, well, how did you get to this quicker? But I think one thing that I find extremely different from this is it's really requiring more upfront discussion of goals. And it has been a learning curve for clients to focus more time on discussing the project and where we're going, as opposed to already having an idea of what you need and just getting you started. If a client comes to me and know that they just want me to create an interview, they may be a little put off if I'm trying to have more conversation broader than just an interview. But I would argue that broader conversation is critical and can provide them with additional insight into their own systems as well. So we do have to define the research objectives. We do have to develop a methodology that aligns. And at the end of the day, the real value add comes from that holistic evaluation. It provides important context for you as a researcher. How do I best establish my research and answer these questions? And the more information you have, the better you're going to be. But it also leads to better insight into the needs and capabilities, not only for your specific research, to be honest, but also gives the client more information more broadly. And I think that's where the third prong really comes in, and I'm not sharing that with you. So these are the evaluation factors. Apologies. I got the documentation and implementation features. Here are all your data collection efforts and how you can use those data sources across the board. And here's how it's different. I do think these upfront discussion and these goals are critical. The holistic evaluation is the real value add, to be honest. And at the end of the day, it puts you in a place as a strategic advisor, a strategic partner. And that's the real value add, I think, from this type of work, and how this can establish you as a go-to partner for your clients. What I wanted to share to illustrate this a little bit better is a couple of case studies. And this just shows you how this has happened as a small portion of a project, as well as the focus of a project that I've had. And the small portion, I'm going to talk about some entry-level work that we did in a trade space. Client comes, they have a specific request. We want you to just develop a tool to focus on reducing turnover. Very specific, very straightforward. The request was actually more specific than that. It wasn't just a tool to reduce turnover. It was a tool that really focused on grit. Can you measure grit, and how that can be leveraged to reduce turnover overall? And so part of this one, before we got into it, because you could just jump into the job analysis, you could just start looking at the job as the contextual factors and start creating an assessment aligned to this. We took a little bit of a broader perspective on that upfront data evaluation and requests. So we looked a little bit more in depth for their selection process and where they were sourcing candidates. We talked about a little bit more on the back end in terms of what happens after someone's hired. What does the training process look like? Is turnover really in training or after they transition to on the job? Do we also have any other issues beyond that might lead to the factors of what causes turnover? So we looked at exit interviews, we looked at interviews with current employees, we looked at supervisor interviews, we talked to HR, and any other feedback that was collected that would provide any insight into this. And that was really important because at the end of the day, yes, we can develop a tool. Yes, we can have some really important contextual factors for the job that are identified in a biodata-esque tool to show that people who have had similar experiences or job exposures are more likely to stick around. But one important factor that we found through that research is, although that might move the needle, that wasn't going to address their issue. Their issue actually was much broader. It was more of an interaction with managers and new employees. And that interaction and some struggles there actually led to the majority of their turnover. We weren't addressing that. We didn't have the capability for our particular request to really look into it, but we were able to provide feedback on that and context around how there could be other components that, that could influence turnover and really make a difference for them long term. So again, a small sliver of an expansion. And if that's part of your typical, that's fantastic. We would collect this information, but we went a little bit farther beyond this one than we probably would if we were just focused on developing the tool. Where this has blossomed, I think, into very focused research and in-depth research is we've had full projects where this was the only project. And one really good example is we've had some skilled hire where the need was really evaluate our selection tools. That's how they couched it, selection tools, but it was selection process. You come in and just take a look. Two pieces that they were primarily concerned with beyond just a risk assessment and a professional rigor in how everything was pulled together was candidate experience, making sure candidates felt like this was a very good experience and had a great reaction to the client as a provider, but also they wanted to reduce long-term costs. They were concerned that they were not efficient and maybe they were doing some manual stuff and they really wanted some additional input to see if there were areas where they could focus on here. So the only part and point of this particular project was to pick apart everything we could from recruiting all the way to onboarding and understand all of it. And so this took all of those pieces in turn. We started with the research focus. What are the pieces that you really want to focus on? And we did risk identification, process efficiencies, there's candidate experience here. We moved into discussions with them to say, okay, well, if those are our focus, what are our evaluation criteria? How are we going to determine whether or not it's a high risk or not great from a candidate experience? How are we going to define that and evaluate all this information coming in? And then what do you have available? How can we collect this information and make sure that we're collecting everything we could be collecting? And this spanned from document review, interviews with vendors, and getting history around why tools were in place from the beginning and what issues they were having. We got candidate feedback, we talked to interviewers, we even went into training techniques, pretty much the whole gamut, anything we could rip apart. And the whole point was to make sure at the end of the day we could give them the insights to everything. Here is every aspect of your selection process. Here's all the information we collected and leveraged. Here was how we evaluated it, and here are the results of that evaluation. And they actually used that information to plan much broader efforts. So it was a starting point for them, a way to understand holistically what they had in front of them and start to prioritize particular research efforts. So we became almost a vehicle to give them so much more information, most of which we weren't even going to implement or potentially work on. We could help identify another vendor that could do some assessment development work if that was the case. They had a lot of internal projects that spurred off of this type of work. And then there was a cache of additional research that we were doing in relation to this as a second phase. But for me, I think that's where this has been a really nice avenue. I didn't have clients previously even interested in anything beyond just create a tool. And it took conversations about, well, this skill set's really important for these other reasons. And let's talk about what you have and how just the creation of a tool isn't necessarily going to fix all of your problems. And so that's really blossomed into this ability to expand or contract how in-depth this is, but put this on the upfront of our projects to put us in a better position to be better prepared to do what they're asking us to do, but also give more to our clients in terms of perspective so that we're seen as a strategic implementer as opposed to just an implementer, something that we give it a little bit more thought. Pay equity, you're probably going to see this as much more relevant to what I'm talking about. I very much love the selection process for review pieces, but the pay equity components, there's more of a corollary, and I think there are fewer folks delving into the space, and I think we can have a real value add in this space, and I would encourage you to develop this skill set. Quick shout out to Dr. Murray Simpson and Michael Mott. I work with them quite often in pay equity space, and they have helped contribute to sort of the way I think on this, and so I just wanted to call that out before I get into the rest of this information. Also, pay equity, definitely get legal involved. I would not conduct a pay equity review without some sort of acknowledgement from legal or a pass that you don't need that umbrella. All right, pay equity reviews. And I wish this was interactive because I would love to say, what do you think of when I say pay equity reviews, and get you all to talk and tell me. I would love that. I think that most people would think of the analytics, right? Is there a difference between how men and women are paid or other subgroups are paid? And that is an important component to pay equity reviews. And I'm going to focus on them a little bit, not how to do them. We could spend another full day talking about that. But I am going to talk a little bit about how IOs can contribute to portions outside of just the analytics. And then I'm going to go a little bit broader than that. Other ways that we can influence this space, and we might not even know that we can influence it. If you are conducting analyses, though, I just want to do a quick plug here. Of course, make sure you have and identify the right question to address. There are lots of different ways you could come at pay equity. You could see if there's a disparity, pattern of disparity in base pay rates. You could look at whether or not women lag behind men with regard to merit increases. You could focus on bonus pay or equity grants. You could do really an OFCCP style compensation audit, which is completely different than you might do it if it's proactive. So make sure you really delve into what the right question is that you're addressing. And then master how best to compare employees. That's one area I'm going to talk about where IOs can be really impactful. Know the relevant data elements to collect. Another critical piece to actually performing the analyses, and another area I'm going to highlight where IOs can be impactful. And then stay up to date on analytic methods. Depending on your data and how it's structured and all the assumptions, you may change what those methods and which methods would be most appropriate. So, other ways that we can contribute, though, that I'm going to focus on when we're talking about the analyses, the two that I've already mentioned, forming those employee comparison groups and evaluating the explanatory pay factors. Those are two I'm going to flesh out in a little bit more detail. And the last two I'm going to end with are showing how pay practice and policy reviews become really important. It's going to harken back a little bit to that selection process review. Some of the same characteristics there are going to be important here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about broader compensation component research. Some of this we already do, and I just think we fail to connect the dots that it influences pay equity. So I'm going to go through these one by one. So the first one, comparison groups. And if you're not familiar with the pay equity space, I'm going to set each of these up by what I mean when I say like forming employee comparison groups, and then I'm going to talk about the IO impact for each one. When you're conducting this type of work, the upfront decision, honestly, is knowing how to create those comparison groups. You have to compare people to one another. So how are you grouping them is a very important first step and first decision. And so any analyst would work with subject matter experts with the employer. They talk about how best to form groups. Those individuals are usually more knowledgeable about the work and what's similar and what's not, and it's going to be very useful to have those conversations. Often, when you're doing proactive, you would form what we call similarly situated employee groups, or SSEGs, and those often align with Title VII standards. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what the Title VII standards are. But it's important to note from the graph on the slides here that all the standards change depending on which framework you're really looking at. So you could have the Title VII, where we're really focusing on similar skills, like qualifications and levels of responsibility. We could even be more tailored, we could be more tailored or more broad depending on where we're going from there. So you get more broad with maybe state pay law. You can get a little bit more narrowly defined when we talk about equal pay, which is really substantially equal work. And then you have the farthest broad, which is OFCCP pay analysis groups, where potentially, depending on the data and how the analyses are constructed, you could have employees across different jobs or different groups combined, and then have statistical controls to ensure that workers are similarly situated. I'm not going to get into the statistical nuances of some of these arguments. It's very fascinating. Just know that the framework matters, and it's going to change how you're going to group people together for your analyses. So why is this important for IOs, or why I think IOs are very well suited to this? And I think this graph sets it up perfectly. You have a framework. You know that you have to establish employee groups in some way, and here we have the example of Title VII. That is defined, so you know that we're looking at similar work with similar skills, similar qualifications, and levels of responsibility. And then the next step is, how do you collect this information or make sure that you have those accurate comparison groups? And this feels right in our wheelhouse, right? We're talking about skills and qualifications, levels of responsibility. There has to be some sort of methodology out there that can be useful in defining what this might look like. And the way I've sort of thought about this is, man, the benefits of work analysis or job analysis are just overwhelming here. This is similar information that we might try to collect as part of a work analysis project. We would use multiple sources to collect information, whether it's from document reviews, if we do interviews or surveys, maybe we have other sources as well. to help us really look into this. And it's agile. You know, depending on what you're trying to get at with your job analysis, you may establish your methodology slightly different or look for different sources of data to make sure that you've collected the right information. And here, again, we could structure data collection methodologies to focus on similar skills, qualifications, and levels of responsibility, exactly how the employee comparison groups are defined. And so the IO perspective really adds value when that goal is to evaluate work and workers. And it can really help us determine who is similar in these characteristics. And so it's very, very similar to the work that IOs would perform in defining and evaluating work for other types of efforts, like a work analysis or even validity transportability study. The additional notes that I'll say on here is that even job analysis, in a broad sense, has become generally accepted, if you will, as a viable research methodology. So it may be a highly defensible approach to determining this. I'm not saying it has to be this way, but it's a sound methodology that is agile. We can adjust it based on how we're trying to collect that information. Of course, the usefulness and persuasiveness of that job analytic work, however, really hinges on a researcher's ability to align the research activities and the data collection efforts to the original purpose and really to answer that original question of work similarity. So it's important to note that, of course, the level of effort or specificity will vary depending on the situation. And just like in proactive IO work generally, you may not have the resources to do the most exhaustive across the board, and maybe proactive scenarios don't necessarily require that, but that might change if you're doing it, let's say, for litigation purposes. You might completely overhaul the way that you're approaching this. And this idea of comparison groups is really important, and I think if you're really interested in this type of work and you're interested to read a fascinating take on an actual case, you can look at OFCCP versus Oracle. They just had the administrative law judge ruled on that case in 2020, and there's a lot in there. You guys could read for days. It was a very long case, and so there's a lot to digest there. But one piece that stuck out related to this is that one criticism of some of the analytics that were conducted was that there was a lack of focus on similarly situated employees with respect to the work performed. And so even in that ruling, they harken back to this of how important it is to make sure that your comparison groups are in fact the right comparison groups. So moving on to explanatory pay factors. What do I mean by that? In light of the questions you're trying to address, knowledge about the actual compensation structure and decision-making process is critical. So there's how we're going to compare people, and how we're going to evaluate pay differences, and how we're going to leverage those demographic variables to see if there are any differences across subgroups. So you have to prepare data elements that you're going to request and collect. So getting the right ones are really important. And the discussion we just had, or that I espoused at you, on employee comparison groups, you'll collect data or data elements related to that to help you define who is similarly situated. And that could be division, department, job family, job grade, job title, maybe job level. There's a whole bunch of potential information there. This is not an exhaustive list of things you could ask for or that might be important. This is just to give it as illustrative purposes. So that first bucket is information you would use to help categorize people in comparison groups. The last bucket is your demographic information. You're interested in subgroup differences. The middle bucket's what I'm focusing on here, where explanatory pay factors. Those are legitimate pay factors where the company either pays for these types of things, or you would expect these to explain the legitimate reasons why people are different in pay. And so often you'll have organizations that pay for prior experience. Maybe they pay for the longer time you're in a job or at the company, you'll make more money. Maybe they do a market-based decision when they're hiring folks, so market rate midpoints might be included. Perhaps you pay more for certain geographic, different locations. Paying for performance is an often cited factor, and there can be many, many others. Often employers, you'll work with an employer and they'll essentially assert which factors drive pay. It's usually in their pay policies of how they're establishing this. And these are some commonly used types of pay factors. But where I think this becomes potentially useful from an IO perspective is when you start getting into how to evaluate pay factors, because not everything can be thrown into your analyses. And when I say the analyses, regression models are usually utilized in pay equity analyses, and you would include these explanatory factors to account for variability in pay. And at the end of the day, what you hope to see is there's no statistically significant difference on the basis of sex or race or other protected class. But there's also guidance out there about how to evaluate pay factors. And in particular, the language in the Paycheck Fairness Act, which hasn't passed Congress, and some recently amended state equal pay laws, a lot of them limit explanatory pay factors to those that are, quote, bona fide. And I just wanted to throw up here what that definition of bona fide is. And this is an example of that definition from the California Fair Pay Act. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but at the end of the day, what this is saying is that it's the factor's not based on or derived from sex, race, or ethnicity, that it's job related or has a business necessity, and they define what business necessity looks like. And the other piece here is that there's not an alternative business practice that exists that would serve the same business purpose. Interesting to note that also OFCCP, and when I say that, and I don't think I said who that was earlier, that's the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. Federal contractors have some guidelines from the OFCCP to be a federal contractor. They also provide guidance in the pay space. And one thing that they note in terms of explanatory pay factors is this idea that they're actually going to test to confirm that your factors, what you are putting forward as an explanation of pay differences, that those are predictive of pay, which makes sense, and that they're neutral with respect to race, sex, and or ethnicity. And if they're not, if there are sex, race, or ethnicity differences in those, they'll omit those factors from their review. So that's important to know what you can and cannot use as explanatory factors and how you evaluate what can be included in those types of analyses. So why do I see an N for IOs here? Don't you find it eerily similar to things that we deal with and constructs we struggle with in the world of selection? The way this is set up here, not the same, but it is in a similar vein with the three prongs that we would take from an employment test perspective. And so it's very similar in the idea that, one indication of subgroup differences. After that, can we show job relatedness or business necessity? And after that, there's a third prong from a suitable alternatives. So this is in the space that we work in and are comfortable grappling with in terms of questions and research to help address this. And so this can be an opportunity where we could take those skills that we have and the lessons we've learned on how to approach these types of ideas from a selection world and how we might be able to get information that would be important to help identify and demonstrate that our explanatory pay factors are viable. And so I think this is another just great example of how, although not a direct overlay, it's a different space, still same concepts, still same skill sets that we can leverage to be informative and impactful. I only have two more to go over here. I'm going to skip through the pay policy and practice a little bit because I don't want to rehash everything that we talked about in terms of selection review, but it's very, very similar. When I talk about a review of pay policies and practices, it is very focused, but what I've found in these, and we've had clients come and just request this, A pay and policies review and a review of pay policies and practices, of course, focus on policy documents. We often will have components of transparency or communication about pay practices. There's usually a component of actual pay equity studies as part of it. That way, if there are any indications of potential areas of interest, our review of policies and our talking with folks in the job, it'll actually pinpoint us on where additional research would be most useful. So the same tenets we talked about with the selection practice, I think are really important in this realm too, understanding the focus and what we're targeting, coming up with different evaluative components that matter in this space, and then being creative with our data collection efforts and how we're going to go through that. So same idea. What I have learned though is that when you're doing a review of pay policies and practices, a lot more content falls under that than you might expect. Would you expect to also evaluate selection tools as part of a pay policy and practice review? Probably not, right? Well, why would I do that? Well, sometimes selection decisions, if those decisions have the flexibility to align someone to a level, could impact pay. And so we want to make sure that all of the decision points that that influence pay or an input to pay are in fact job related, and we're evaluating for structure and level of discretion. So we often will look at hiring processes or decisions around level of a particular job. We would look at starting pay practices and the decisions around that, maybe some evaluation of decisions there. This can have implications for performance review tools, especially if those tools are related to merit increases based on your scores and how people are evaluated there. We would look at promotion practices because that has a direct influence on pay as well as other types of pay policies around variable pay and other bonuses and decisions for that. So it can be quite all-encompassing when you get into a review of the pay policies and practices. And the last piece related to pay that I wanted to touch on is just expanding that thought of how pay touches so much more of our work than we really acknowledge sometimes. I have a simplistic framework here. You can be way more sophisticated than I was on this particular slide, but in general, here are some buckets of the pay components, and then I'm going to walk through where we as IOs have the skill set to add value in addressing certain questions related to each of these. So hiring and placement, starting salary, merit pay, bonus pay, and other variables of pay or variable pay, promotion and promotional pay are the buckets that I've highlighted. And what I want to focus on with those is this idea that across the board, regardless of which compensation component we're really referencing, the real value add from the IO perspective is conducting research related to job relatedness, for instance, of the factors that would be driving pay or pay decisions, but also evaluation of decision processes for potential outright bias or a lack of structure or undue discretion. I think there's a real opportunity there to showcase how our skills are well suited to that type of work. And I alluded to this, but let me talk about it in a little bit more detail. That although the hiring and placement decisions may seem out of bounds for compensation, it really does set the stage for an individual's earning potential at an organization. So if the factors used to make a selection decision into higher paying jobs are not job related, or they're systematically eliminating women from consideration or any other subgroup, then those individuals who are systematically eliminated won't be placed into those jobs. And thereby, it essentially reduces their earning potential at the organization. On the other side of the coin here, you also have bias in the selection process itself, potentially, either intentional or unintentional, where maybe you have particular groups that are steered away from certain jobs and maybe even into lower paying jobs due to perceived fit or physical requirements of higher paying jobs. So even though this is not in the typical understanding of pay work, I think the work that we typically do in job relatedness and our evaluation of selection processes do have an impact in the broader understanding of pay equity. But even the other components, you'll probably see a more direct link, to be honest, with pay. But I think each one of these, like starting salary, the decisions that go into setting that, whether it's experience or qualifications, even merit pay, where we're looking at potentially performance reviews, bonus pay or other variables. You might have meeting some sort of standard or production metric to get that bonus or other variable pay. And then promotion decisions themselves. Some of this can be based on experience. There could be some other performance-based indicators that would go into that decision. These decisions, all of them, can result in subgroup differences, and really it's important for us to make sure that those decisions are based on job-related components. And so the job relatedness is a very easy win for us to be able to conduct some research there. On the other side, you could also look at that decision process and that level of standardization or that level of discretion around some of those, and we can provide input for that as well. And you can see some examples here, whether or not there is bias in the merit pay itself and some of the decisions that are made, or how high is the level of discretion with bonus. All of these can be really important, to fully understand and evaluate in the broader scheme, and to give information to clients. And I think IOs are well versed in doing this type of work. So as quick parting thoughts, hopefully you can see where I was going with this. Is some of this isn't typical work that you would just think of the off the street IO doing pay equity work, and a lot of IOs do this and they do it well. There are others that we partner with, often labor economists often will do this type of work too. And I think that from an analytics standpoint, of course, there's a lot of value add there. But I think this broader understanding is really useful as well, because we can show more value beyond just the analytics and the type of work that we do. And I think the outline from the selection process reviews are a good example for that in the broader sense. So for me, adding the value for IOs is really looking for ways to expand our skills or sell our skills in other contexts. Really showing that we can be a strategic partner, not just an implementer of a particular thing. I want this assessment. Yes, I can do that assessment, and as I do that, I'm going to provide you with some additional context around other ways that you can improve your processes or things you should think about as well. Of course, context matters. Understanding your client and the current climate will help guide everything that you do, regardless if you're doing this type of work, any work that you're going to be doing. And of course, being creative when developing your research methodologies and your data collection efforts. Clients really love this when you can be agile and responsive to their needs, but also being creative in how you're collecting that type of information. And it just shows that it's not a one size fits all, that you understand where they're coming from and you're adjusting to align. And of course, at the end of the day, no corners cut to the point where you are compromising professional integrity. Be true to what you know and you've learned and who you are, but other places where you can go off the beaten path and be creative and be agile, I think is always well received and respected from the clients that we have. And that is it.
Thank you, Emilee. We did not have any questions in the chat. It looks like we had a couple of +1s and compliments on your graphics. If anyone does have any questions for Emilee, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question, or post in the chat. Thank you.
Hey, Emilee, it's Martha. How are you?
I'm just fine, Martha. How are you?
I'm well. So my question is, you talked a little bit about sort of the stance of a proactive assessment versus a reactive assessment, or in response to sort of a challenge. If you're in the realm of a proactive assessment, and you don't necessarily have all of the variables or information that might be helpful for interpreting pay, do you believe, or can you talk a little bit about the value of actually doing a less than complete analysis versus really taking the time? Because in a proactive stance, you may not have the oomph behind you to do something more extensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I will plug again that I think legal counsel is imperative in this type of instance. I think if you're doing proactive studies to understand what's going on, potentially direct research, Martha, maybe it's to highlight particular areas. You want to do a little bit more of a deeper dive into why there might be differences and better understand that. I think doing a study with the best you can is not a terrible idea. It gives you information. I would want it underprivileged because, one, it's not complete. You definitely don't want to get into a realm where you're making adjustments when you're not confident that you have the right explanatory factors in there, because that might undermine your ability to make accurate changes. And if you make those changes and it backfires, it just puts you in a completely different world. So I would hesitate there. But if you're doing these types of things just to better understand the lay of the land, maybe you're developing a comp philosophy and you're trying to figure out which factors really matter for you, and you're doing some of this research in tandem. If you're using it that way, I think it can be useful. But if you really want it for decision-making purposes and you want it for pay adjustments, then making sure that you got it right, I think, is the best way to go, and doing it under privilege so that you can really understand those and make sure that you're communicating that the way it should be. Is that helpful? Does that answer your question?
Okay. We also have 3 questions in the chat from Andrea, who I will, Emilee, if you're able to access those, I'll let you navigate through.
So how do you typically approach a situation when there's no data available or it's across multiple platforms? Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Yes, that happens. If we're talking pay, I think that's a unique situation. Pay, you need data. It's hyper sensitive. That's something that needs to be based on accurate information that's coming in. Often though, when we do other types of research, even for selection practices, you know that a lot of information can come from different sources. We can have different tools that are providing pieces of this. I think it's important to do the best you can. I think it's important to try to remedy some of those issues along the way. What we've been doing as part of these selection process reviews and even the pay equity reviews is identifying data requirement issues or data concerns, maybe lacking data, data we're not comfortable with, it doesn't seem like it's accurate, having process owners that can really understand that and do it. We've been using these pay studies, these pay reviews to help fix that. And I think going back to the answer for Martha is when you don't have good data, you're putting yourself at risk. And so part of these projects have been, how are we putting ourselves at risk and how can we fix some of that? And I think when you start to identify these things where there's no data or your platforms aren't talking to one another, you're really establishing ways to make them talk, or new methodologies to capture and accurately capture and reliably produce the information that you would need for any of your studies. The secondary question was, when you present findings of the overall system selection process from the broad approach, how do you make it less overwhelming? Yes. How do you ask the client which direction they would like to take? This is a great question. And I think it depends on your client and how savvy they are and what they want to see. But I've done this a couple times, and each time it's a little bit different, but it's really nice to put it in bite size, and those evaluation criteria are going to be really important to define, and we've actually presented it in multiple ways. So we have presented it from just the evaluation criteria. So documentation, does it exist? And does it exist across these components? Your testing tools, your recruitment process, your training and your onboard, whatever it might be that you're evaluating. We presented sort of a matrix that red light, yellow light, green lights it to give them a snapshot of which component has more areas of concern and across what functions. Is it we're just not documenting it, or is it that our research isn't, maybe it has holes, or maybe there's updated research that needs to be conducted, or do we have data flags that have indicated subgroup differences and potential risk items? So I think it really depends, but we layer it on. So we may start with that, and then we'll break out a particular component. Let's just look at recruiting and really dig into that and understand that. And then from that, we've actually translated that into conversations about priorities. And so we're like, okay, let's get your legal team in here, your TA team in here. Let's talk about each of these in turn and figure out, what is a priority, how we want to address this, and maybe you can come up with a stair-step process to say, these are what we're going to target this year. This is going to be on docket next year, and we'll, take a look and revamp as needed. So we've done that, and that's been relatively successful. The last question I see is, how do you convey the importance of the broader approach to clients, and do you often find resistance? Do you have any tips regarding that? Sometimes the broader approach is too much for them to bite off and chew right out the gate. So I can tell you from experience from one particular client, we did this in little bite sizes where we tried to stretch as much as we could, and in some instances we did it slightly out of scope for us. Like, we would eat the slightly out of scope issue here, not pass that on to them, just so that we could give a business, it's almost like a business case of, this works. Like, look at what we did. You didn't really ask us to do this, but we had this really great extra piece here. And what we found is, as you start to do those, and I'm not saying go crazy here, we all work for businesses, and we have to do what we've scoped to do. And so these have been very small value adds. But as they start to see them, and as they start to understand how that could be important for them, we send them asking for more. Okay, well, what else did you see? Oh, well, we didn't do research. You didn't ask us to do that. Most certainly, we could couch a particular project to, really focus on this review and flesh this out with you. And I think that's been the kicker for some, is getting a little taste for it and be like, oh, I didn't know this was even a problem. I want to look at that a little bit more. Others have just come full in. Yes, of course, we want to know all of this before we make any decisions, because having you come in and create new assessments is a huge effort, whereas this is a smaller bite-sized thing, and we get a lot more information out of it. So we've also sold it as a cost-effective tool for scoping future work.
Thank you.
Okay, I will give it another minute for any questions for Emilee, and anyone who would like to stay on and going to networking via breakout rooms. We will have a random assignment for any participants who are left, probably in groups of 5 or 6 momentarily. But I'll give another minute or so for any questions. Okay, will join me in thanking Dr. Tison for her time today and her wonderful presentation. Thank you everyone for the wonderful questions. And we will now break out into some networking rooms. Thank you.